So, I've been doing this now for a year, and as is the custom with 98% of YouTube channels that make it this far, that means I'm due a special anniversary special to commemorate this special momentous special day. Special. Even though my first upload was technically on the 2nd of June, it doesn't matter. It's close enough for me. So this year, to celebrate a whole 12 months of pain and suffering, I decided that rather than cover just one film, I'd instead talk about a much fondly remembered, and yet much overlooked genre of filmmaking. The public information film. Of course, public information films still exist worldwide, and they aren't really planning on going anywhere anytime soon. But public information films, PIFs for short, almost are a craft in and of themselves. They cover a wide variety of themes, styles and genres, all in the desperate attempt to put across to the audience that they shouldn't put that thing in their mouth, that not putting your finger in there is probably a good idea, and that running head-on into traffic without a luminous sticker on your jacket could prove deadly. With this being a rather broad topic, and a rather special episode in and of itself, I thought I'd draft in some help for this video. A good friend of mine, an avid PIF viewer, Ben.
Hello Dan, pleasure to be here. Even though I can't see you, your voice is exquisite agony to me.
I'm glad you're suffering. Anyway, without further ado, would you mind filling the folks in at home about the history of PIFs? Please?
What we know is the public information film first began in the Second World War would often be shown in cinema reels, starring this chap Richard Massingham, and were generally to help with general war efforts like not to spread diseases and how to grow vegetables and that kind of thing. As the war ended, public information films continued to be produced. The Central Office of Information was the government department set up to take care of these, generally through hiring independent contractors and later on advertising firms. These kind of films were extremely popular, particularly in the 60s to the 80s, as they were mainly designed to fill up airtime between TV programmes, generally about 20 to 30 seconds worth. They were cheap, cheerful, and very easy to make and produce, which is why they were so popular in this period from about the 60s to the 80s, when there was so much airtime to fill between TV programmes, they had to provide something.
Nicely handled, sir.
Alright.
So now you know the backstory of how things got started. Both myself and Ben have picked a handful of our favourite PIFs, which we'll first show you in full and then talk about afterwards. Look, I told you at the start this was going to be a special. That means this is going to be a bumper length one. No holds barred.
Ooh, can I do Dark and Lonely Water?
But I wanted to do Dark and Lonely Water.
I want to do Dark and Lonely Water.
Alright, but someday I get to do the finishing line. I'll get the ball rolling then with this one.
You know, you should use the pedestrian crossing. You should look right, look left, look right again, and then, if all's clear, proceed with caution. Oh, thank you very much, Gaffer. I say, Chappie, where do you think you're off to?
Well, it's my crossing when I put my foot on it, and you're supposed to stop.
Oh, one of those, are you? Yes. Well, I know something about this. Oh, let me see, what is it? Yes, yes.
Yeah, you gotta look, Daddy-O, like you gotta make with the people.
Of course. So there.
But you're supposed to proceed with caution when approaching a crossing. Thank you. That's just what I was gonna say.
Eh? Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
And you're not supposed to dawdle, you gotta get along. Yahoo!
Quite. You see?
Ha! Come along, missus, don't dawdle.
Oh, what are you doing? No, young man, big frozen peas. No, what about me peas?
But seriously, folks, everyone should use the crossings properly. See you.
This, frankly quite wonderful little short, comes from 1963, and's probably one of the earliest examples of public information films physically using celebrities in their films to try and promote safety. In this case, he is veteran UK comedian and all-round eccentric Ken Dodd, teaching children and adults, who should know better, how to use pedestrian crossings. At this point, crossings had only really been used since 1951, though there had been limited trials since the late 1940s. So with a nationwide rollout still well underway, what better person than Doddy, a household name at this point in British history, to show the nation the do's and don'ts of operating the crossings safely. They've opted in this short to go for humour, playing to the strength of their talent. Ken was made for stuff like this, and the whole thing has a very jolly and bouncy feel to it. Even though the image of Ken Dodd as an elderly woman will haunt my nightmares for many years to come, it's a very brief, well-shot slice of physical comedy that I don't think could have been made in this day and age. It's so drenched in that early to mid-60s culture that it could have only really existed in this specific period of time. The PIF ends with one of the most genuinely sincere moments I've ever seen put to film. Most people who've met Ken Dodd will say he's a genuine and lovely person, and that warmth really comes across in those last few seconds. For young children, this really puts the message across in a non-threatening, hands-off way that the crossings need to be used with care. It still puts its message across firmly, but without using shock to try and embed the message into people's heads. As British a PIF you'll ever see. Well, short of the Dad's Army PIF on road safety at least.
There is now a danger that has become a threat to us all. It is a deadly disease and there is no known cure. The virus can be passed during sexual intercourse with an infected person. Anyone can get it, man or woman. So far it's been confined to small groups, but it's spreading. So protect yourself. And read this leaflet when it arrives. If you ignore AIDS, it could be the death of you. So don't die of ignorance.
There were two versions made of this famous campaign in the late 1980s, the iceberg version and the monolith version, both directed by the rather excellent and sadly no longer with us John Hurt. When the company who produced these commercials, Saatchi and Saatchi, presented them to the government felt that they were a little bit too Hollywood, a little bit too over the top. But really that's kind of the idea. If there's one thing you can say about public information films, they're not about the art of being subtle. They're about a good, hard kick in the crotch and saying, look, this is the way it is. These particular ads were made to dispel a popular myth that only homosexuals could catch HIV. But you'll notice the language used, the wording. There is now a danger that is a threat to us all, basically implying that there is a deadly disease, as he says, and there is no known cure. It's not just something that can happen to someone else, it can happen to you as well, and it's very serious, as this music illustrates, which is just... There's something about this kind of 1980s Sims that really gets under the skin in a very unpleasant way, and, you know, if anyone can do it that way, it's the combination of John Hurt's booming voice and that big, massive 2001-esque monolith at the end. It's a campaign that's still quoted and referenced today, which, for a public information campaign, is the best sign that it's left its mark on a generation.
This man was safe. Until now. He hasn't bothered to get the plug changed. From now on, he's in deadly danger. If the earth wire slips out, he won't notice. But as soon as it touches the live wire, and anyone who touches him also gets a shock. Fix things properly.
By the 1970s, the idea of showing rather than telling when it came to safety and informing the public was becoming more and more commonplace. Let's face it, if you're asked to remember an important piece of information, are you more likely to retain it having been told nicely by a lovely man, or by witnessing a horrific and traumatising accident firsthand as a result of not remembering that information? Well, in the 70s, the opinion was distinctly aimed at the latter. Electricity hazards is a relatively short PIF in the scheme of things, but the message it puts across is clear. At that time in the 1970s, health and safety, as it's known today, was relatively unknown. Frankly, if you did your job without dying, you were considered not an idiot, and that was it. If you did die on the job, then you'd get a clip round the earhole and you'd have your pay packet docked for wasting the foreman's time. So in the early 70s there was a raft of films that dealt with safety in the workplace, and the best methods of self-preservation to avoid all manner of nasty things from happening to you. Aimed at the common man, these were unlikely to have been shown in the workplace. Rather, these were shown most likely on television, to try and reach as many people as possible. This one in particular deals with making sure your equipment actually has a plug on it, rather than just forcing the wires into a socket on the wall. As someone who wasn't alive when this kind of thing was considered commonplace, the very idea that there was a time when it was deeply unsettles me. This PIF is very matter of fact. The electrocution scene in particular is graphic, and it doesn't shy away from making it very clear: if you don't use a proper plug when using electrical items, you will die. No exceptions. It's blunt and to the point, and in many ways I feel more drawn to PIFs like this than I do the lovely ones. The nice ones have a very charming and overly British attitude towards them, but the shocking ones, well, they lodge themselves firmly in your mind, and they don't ever let go. The fact that this PIF in particular just ends with a simple caption, "Electricity can kill, don't take chances," superimposed over a shot of a plug socket being pried open with 2 matchsticks, only further emphasises how cold and pointed this PIF is. It's guaranteed to stick in the mind of the average worker, who'd probably be using similar tools on a day-to-day basis, and who's probably been placed in similar situations. PIFs like this were very likely to make the average man change their minds about doing something like this in future. Or at the very least, it would thin out the idiots who thought doing that to save time was a perfectly great idea.
Gentlemen, bodily over here, please, madam. Is this all your baggage, madam?
The outcome of a sentimental impulse could mean a sentence of death for the animal you love and couldn't leave behind, and for you or someone like you, death in a manner that is beyond description. Whichever way you look at it, rabies means death.
Death in a manner beyond description. That's how this campaign describes rabies. And to illustrate this point even further, it doesn't so much fake the footage, no, instead it uses real life footage of an actual child crawling and writhing around, dying slowly, not to mention those horrible stabbing synth noises. If there's one thing you can say about these public information films, as well as most of them being short exercises in horror, they were also short exercises in sound design as well. You might say that it's quite silly or dated. Rabies, after all, is not really a common thing we've had in this country. In fact, we've not had it for over 100 years now. But it's still prevalent in a lot of parts of the world. I think France only got rid of it about 50 years ago. It's still prevalent in a lot of Africa and America. And it was a big worry at the time, what with a lot of intercontinental travel going on in the 70s and 80s, that someone would smuggle an adorable little puppy or an adorable little cat, which would then lead to, complete death and destruction, as it does. But, these things don't get made unless they don't think there's a reason, and it clearly left its mark. You don't see a lot of talk of rabies these days, so death in a manner beyond description. And here to illustrate the point.
Who can it be? Perhaps it's your rich Aunt Annie who you love to see outside the front door. Or your loving husband who has lost his key outside the front door. Now I wonder who it is gonna be outside the front door. But stop! On the other hand, could it be that there's a real con man who will take you in outside the front door? Or a mad bad axeman who is deep in sin outside the front door? So put the chain on the door before you let them in through the front door. So put the chain on the door before you let them in through the front door. See who's there first before you open the door. Put the chain on.
Okay, so ignoring the mild sexism of this PIF, I actually really enjoy this one. The animation's very distinctive and it has a bouncy comedic vibe about it. The decision to set this PIF to a song, more importantly a popular song, Green Door by Jim Lowe, later covered by Shakin' Stevens, means it's more likely to stick in an audience's head as a reminder. And the fact that they blow well out of proportions what could happen if you don't put the chain on the door only adds to the eccentricity of the piece. The animation isn't fluid, and it has somewhat of a jittery quality to it. It reminds me quite heavily of Bob Godfrey's work, if not a little more detailed. That being said, the direction of the piece is quite well thought out. It uses a sort of pull back and reveal tactic, lulling the audience into a place of security before saying, "Aha! But what if it isn't your aunt or husband?" It's a little bit Python and a little bit Bonzo Dog Band. Quirky's the best word for it. And, I mean, realistically, if someone really wanted to get into your house, a bit of metal screwed onto your door probably wouldn't stop them. But back in the mid-70s, when women were seen as frail and delicate little things who needed constant protection from the real world, this advert would have probably been solely targeted at them and the elderly. If they played an advert like this now, the complaints would probably be through the roof. As it stood in the 70s, it was probably seen as a genuine attempt to help people. Put the chain on, as far as PIF slogans go, is hardly up there. It's nowhere near Think Bike or Charlie Says, but it does the job. It's simple and to the point. This is one of my favourites, truth be told, and I hope you like it too.
Please keep matches away from children.
So a few things to note about this one. It was shot in an actual burnt out house to really give it that sense of realism, that sense of despair, a bit like the rabies thing we discussed earlier with the shots of the child. With a lot of public information films, and also a lot of horror films in general, there's a sort of disconnect because you're experiencing it through another character's eyes subjectively. But not this time. This is shot with a POV angle to really give it that sense that it's you going through the house, it's you experiencing all this. The implication really is that you're somehow one of the parents that has had to listen to their child being, well, killed, being burnt up. It's a masterpiece of sound design. You have all those quiet little noises, the little drip drops coming through, the breathing of, presumably, was meant to be you, walking through the house, those little creaking noises, and then as it goes on you get those echoed screams of ghosts almost of the children. As we'll learn later, the echo is like the trademark of a lot of these things. If you want to scare the absolute bejesus out of a lot of kids and a lot of adults, just whack a massive echo on that and you'll go far.
It was getting dark before they found him, sir. The body was caught under the ice, you see. Well, his mother said he'd gone off to the pond with the others and she thought they'd be safe on their own. It wasn't that far away. It seems he was sliding out further than the others and the ice wasn't as thick there. What's that, sir? Oh, no, she said she never dreamed it was that dangerous.
Frozen ponds can be dangerous. Always make sure you supervise children. Test the ice before they play on it and make certain they stay close to the shore.
This one's a lot more subtle than most that'll feature in this special, and in many ways it makes it all the more powerful a message for it. I can't personally say it's ever been cold enough where I live that there have ever been frozen ponds for me to go out and walk on, but in the 70s and 80s this must have been a very serious problem, as there were numerous PIFs about the dangers of walking on ice put out around those decades. The early ones usually said that as long as there was an adult present who could test the ice for you, then it'd be fine, though by the 1980s that was well off the table. This entire PIF is presented from the perspective of a police officer reporting back to his sergeant about a kid trapped under the ice. The fact that it's played out from the perspective that it's all already happened adds a real sense of macabre to proceedings. They don't have to directly tell you that you'll die if you fall into a frozen pond. The animation does the job just fine. Speaking of the animation, it's absolutely gorgeous. It has a real smoothness that quite a lot of animation at this point in time just really didn't have, and the colours used throughout are beautifully handled, with the dusky sunset enveloping this entire short in purples and oranges. Poignant. Poignant's the word I'd use to describe this one. Deeply poignant. The voiceover really tries its best to put across the emotional distress this incident has caused the child's family, and it works. It really does. I can't honestly think of the last time a 40-second short has affected me in the way that this short did. It was so successful, it was redubbed and reused in the 90s, with the narrative changed slightly from a police officer reporting the incident to a friend of the child who fell in the ice talking to a policeman. Both are eerily effective and deeply unsettling, though I think the original one just has the edge over proceedings, one to keep in mind every winter.
The first natural-born smoker will have a larger nose to filter out impurities. Self-cleaning lungs, a highly developed index and middle finger, smaller ears because they don't listen, extra eyelids to protect the eye from irritating smoke, and of course, an inbuilt resistance to heart disease, lung cancer, and thrombosis. Unfortunately, the first natural-born smoker hasn't yet been born.
So what we have here is another example of how public information films completely eschewed subtlety and completely eschewed quiet things. What we have is this massive dystopic view. This almost looks very Hollywood. The production values are actually quite impressive for what was basically a filler piece that was made to fill up about 20 seconds of their time. The makeup effects as well, I mean, it's very impressive. It's like proper Hollywood stuff, and it's creepy the way his lungs are slowly breathing in and out, and that bald, sort of demonic face. There's a follow-up to this public information film where we see the natural-born smoker's child. It's shot from the POV of the child, and you can see that horrible demonic face breathing right into the camera, right into, well, essentially your face. It's enough to put you off the fags for life. My favourite line in this is the bit about he has small ears because he doesn't listen. I mean, you want to talk about lack of subtlety, that's like a sledgehammer. It's so sort of, it's brutal. It's aggressively saying, how dare you smoke? How dare you do this? You're going to end up like this, basically. It's not suggesting you're going to end up like a demonic creature, but it's basically saying, you know, if you're going to live your life by just puffing away at these fags all day, you might as well have small ears and not listen. You might as well have self-cleaning lungs, and you might as well have horrible grey skin and just live in this smoky, burny sort of ambience. The whole film really has this sort of, well, smoky vibe. You feel dirty watching it. You feel like you can't breathe while you're watching it, and that's not just the low quality of the video, that is just the quality of the film. For something that was designed to fill up about 30 seconds of time between TV commercials and at the cinema, it really is very impressive.
Behold, one of the most terrifying PIFs I've personally ever seen. Some backstory, if you will. I first got into PIFs in university, and one night, while a little worse for wear, I decided to pop on a DVD from the university's library called Charlie Says. It's a frankly absurd compilation DVD of literally hundreds of these films. So at about 3 in the morning, with headphones on in the middle of the night, I'm just winding down, quietly going through the ads and working on some coursework, when cutting through the silence of the pitch-black room like a knife...
This is every mother's nightmare. You've left your baby for just a moment. While you're gone, the baby starts to rock. The pram tips. Don't let the nightmare come true. If you must leave your baby, always strap him in with care. Never hang bags from the handles. Use a properly fitted shopping basket on your pram or pushchair. Take care. Don't let the nightmare come true.
Where do I even begin with this absolute piece of nightmare fuel? Well, apart from the overall message being slightly upsetting, strap your baby into its pram or it will die, the animation is wavy and nausea-inducing. And the fact that they chose to animate the mother to look like Edvard Munch's The Scream, which they crash zoom into with a piercing, howling scream that's way too loud, is frankly traumatising. Everything about this PIF is designed to shock you and make you feel totally uncomfortable. From the weird pattering synth drums as the baby falls out of the pram, through to the weird broken-framed animations of people walking and trucks passing by. It's like watching it all happen in slow motion. The message is perfectly clear, and believe me, I'll never hang my handbag on the handle of a baby carriage when I have kids. Not after this, anyway. I would say this was definitely one to chalk up to shock tactics work when done right. It's terrifying stuff. Oh, and this was sound balanced, by the way. That scream is literally piercing.
This is every mother's nightmare.
After an attack is over and the all clear has been sounded, arrangements will be made as soon as possible to treat any people who are ill or injured. Listen to your radio. Details will be given about what to do, when to do it, and how. If anyone dies while you are kept in your fallout room, move the body to another room in the house. Label the body with name and address, and cover it as tightly as possible in polythene, paper, sheets, or blankets. Tie a second card to the covering. The radio will advise you what to do about taking the body away for burial. If, however, you have had a body in the house for more than 5 days, and if it is safe to go outside, then you should bury the body for the time being in a trench or cover it with earth and mark the spot of the burial.
So these cheap and cheerful little pieces were never actually intended to be shown. Well, they were intended to be shown, but only if a nuclear attack was 72 hours away. They would have been shown basically between programs all day and all night. Now, just imagine that for a moment. You're sitting there, you're having your tea, you're just a little kid playing your toys, and all of a sudden, you see this frozen, ashen look on your parents' faces, and they just look petrified, and you have no idea why. And you turn to the TV, and you see these weird, funny little cartoons with these white stick figures, and you just don't understand why. That's what that feeling would have been like, that feeling of something is going to happen, but you don't know what it is. And for me, what adds to the dread of these is the fact that a lot of the techniques discussed in these films, I mean, they wouldn't be entirely effective. No one would really survive a nuclear war, and even if you did survive a nuclear war, you wouldn't really want to. You wouldn't really want to live in that world. It's death in a manner beyond description, again. If you're outside, it says, just lie on the floor and hope for the best. That's what these adverts should have been called, not protect and survive, just hope for the best. That would have been very appropriate, more British as well, in a way. I first saw these films when I was about 10 or 11 years old, not on TV. They play on a loop in the Imperial War Museum in Salford, Manchester, if you ever get the time to go. They play on a little tiny screen right under a disused nuclear missile and a giant graph showing exactly what would happen if a nuclear bomb was ever to hit Manchester. And there's a lot of long text and scientific words to summarise the exact effects of what would happen, but they could basically just have a single paragraph that basically just reads, "Commit suicide now." So, as a 10 or 11-year-old watching that, even in the air of somewhere like a museum, where you're consciously looking at things from the past and you can kind of disconnect yourself from it, it's still terrifying. And it's still terrifying despite the cheap graphics, despite the portentous tone that's often been mocked and referenced in lots of popular culture, particularly in the young ones, and not so humorously in Fred's. Unlike a lot of other things we've discussed, like rabies and kids falling in lakes and things like that, nuclear war is still a very real possibility. And seeing as the doomsday clock has just been moved to 2 minutes to midnight, the closest it's been since 1953, mind, when the Cold War was at its absolute height, well, if it's not keeping you awake at night, it probably should.
You can put almost any frail object in a box, and provided it's held firm, you can shake it about no end. But if it's loose in a box, that's another matter. A car is a box on wheels, but a box just the same, and it can still get shaken about. And if you're in it and not wearing a seatbelt, you're in trouble because you're a loose object. It doesn't matter who you are or what you are, you can be the world's most experienced driver, but to the law of gravity, you're the world's most experienced loose object. And it can be very unfunny. Now, an egg hasn't got much in the way of brains, but you have. Wear a seatbelt. And if the box gets shaken up, you stand every chance of not getting broke. No matter how short the journey, nag yourself to remember this drill. Clunk the car door and click the seatbelt. Clunk, click, every trip.
Oh, God. Well, we had to talk about this one. We just had to. It was one of the most successful public information film campaigns of all time. The Clunk Click series of films had a simple message: wear a seatbelt. And with the ridiculously catchy slogan, Clunk Click every trip, it was a household expression in almost no time. I'm not one to whitewash history. You can't undo events that happened no matter how much you want to. Yes, this campaign was fronted by Jimmy Savile, an absolute monster. Seriously, for my international viewers who might not know who he is, go and look up his Wikipedia entry. Or better still, just Google him. You'll see why I was hesitant to include this here. But you can't undo what good things he did, no more than you can undo the utterly, unspeakably evil acts he committed. He invented modern-day DJing, he raised hundreds of thousands of pounds for charity, and he fronted this series of public information films, quite possibly saving hundreds of lives in the process. Does this mean he should be celebrated? Absolutely not. All of this was just a front for the evil acts he committed, but at the same time denying that he did the things that he did, or trying to erase him from existence by not talking about what he did and how approachable and human he seemed at the time, is what allows him and people like him to do what he did. There are people out there who'll say that he should be demonised and removed from history and forgotten about. And that's a perfectly reasonable opinion to have. But in my opinion, he was at the end of the day a human being. And if we allow what he did to be played up to cartoonish proportions, without acknowledging that he used his power and charity work as a front to allow him to commit the acts that he did, we're only opening the door for someone else to try the exact same thing. Savile was an evil man, but in the 1970s, he was a much-loved family entertainer, and a highlight of evening television and radio for many. The Clunk Click films are blunt but effective. This particular one, featuring loose objects, is very basic, and really puts the message across of just how important seatbelts really are in making sure that you don't die horribly. In many ways, this PIF is the best of both worlds, because it uses the egg as a soft metaphor for the person involved in the car crash, whilst also cutting to footage of cars flying through the air and crashing horrifically. The contrast of the soft and harsh imagery really causes this to stick out in your mind. In the simplest of terms, it reaches both audiences by being shocking and gentle at the same time. Saville is very matter-of-fact throughout this film too. He's blunt and doesn't sugarcoat it particularly. When he says, "An egg doesn't have much in the way of brains, but you have," it's a bit of a silly sentence, but his delivery is so straight it drills into your head and makes you really aware of exactly just how important wearing a seatbelt is. These films ran for close to a decade, possibly even longer than that. What research I've done doesn't seem to list an endpoint for the campaign. I mean, for all I know, they may still be running somewhere out there. Other than possibly Charlie Says and the Green Cross Code Man, Clunk Click may have been one of the most memorable public information campaigns ever run. So the next time you get in a car, just remember, Clunk Click every trip.
I am the spirit of dark and lonely water, ready to trap the unwary, the show-off, the fool. And this is the kind of place you'd expect to find me. But no one expects to find me here. It seems too ordinary. But that pool is deep. The boy is showing off. The bank is slippery. The show-offs are easy. But the unwary ones are easier still. This branch is weak, rotten. It'll never take his weight. Only a fool would ignore this. But there's one born every minute. Under the water there are traps, old cars, bedsteads, weeds, hidden depths. It's the perfect place for an accident.
Oh, look, there's someone in the water. Quick, use that big stick to get him out.
Sensible children. I have no power over them.
Oi, mate, that's a stupid place to swim. Hey, go over and get that thing to wrap him in. You don't have to feel cold, mate. How long was you in there? Ew, what thing?
I'll be back.
So, it's the 1970s. A lot of children are dying by swimming in local ponds and lakes and reservoirs, and you want to make a film that's telling them how not to do that. What do? The answer is, you get Donald Pleasance in a creepy Grim Reaper-esque mask, and you have him stalk these children as they slowly die horribly. Now, this is something that has been said a few times, but it is worth repeating because it is the key to understanding a lot of this, is that subtlety is not an art that these films use. To have the image of a Grim Reaper-esque figure lurking over these children, the literal embodiment of death, it's something that probably sounds quite ridiculous when you say it in words, but glimpsed through this 1970s foggy, hazy, hauntological kind of filter, it's something that is really hard to describe in words. Dark and Lonely Water is something that still unsettles to this day. Even though we're not seeing news stories and adverts about kids dying in ponds, that proves the point. It proves the point because it stuck with a generation, and that generation took that message to heart. Ergo, the message of not being subtle worked brilliantly. The key line in this to take away is the part where the kid is saved at the end, and you hear the voice go, "Sensible children, I have no power over them," implying that if you're a sensible child, you won't have this horrible Grim Reaper-esque figure stalking you, which to a small child who doesn't know any different from what's on TV and what's real, probably did assume that a horrible figure was coming. And even adults who know better can still watch this and still be spooked to this day. And of course, we have to mention their famous ending tagline, "I'll be back," which again has that massive whammy of an echo on it to really hammer the point home. What Jaws did for the beach, this did for your local reservoir. If you even stepped foot in a local pond, you can bet that that figure was going to come. And considering that this later showed up in Channel 4's list of the 100 scariest moments, and that's scariest moments in anything, film, TV, whatever, which just goes to show how, despite its very obvious 1970s setting, it still transcends generations. Case in point, I used to play near a river near my house. I actually had nightmares of that grim spectral figure standing just on the foot of the lake, standing on the water like he does in the first shot of this, which just goes to show how once you've seen these films, they will never leave the subconscious. They'll always be there ready, waiting to trap the unwary the show-off, the fool. Public information films are still being produced to this day, however they are few and far between. Organisations like Fire Kills, the NSPCC and the Think campaign are all still technically running. However, the Central Office of Information, COI, which produced the bulk of these films, closed its doors in 2011. As there's less space to fill between TV programmes these days, more room for advertising interests and things like that, there's generally less of a need.
During the period of 2010 to the present day, many public information films and aspects of public information films have simply transitioned into new social media, with many advertising campaigns being run through the NSPCC and the RSPCA and various other organisations through websites like Instagram and as advertisements on Facebook. Social media has been a real help in promoting causes and activities, and as a result, public information film didn't die, it just transitioned. It's now a different medium, and still possibly as effective as it ever was. So I hope you enjoyed our little wander through some of the highs and terrifying nightmares that were British public information films. Ben, thank you so much for taking your time out of your busy schedule to help me work through this one.
Alright.
And hopefully we'll see you here again next year for the same gubbins. Well, barring a nuclear attack. Actually, speaking of nuclear attacks,